Τα στοιχεία για τη συγκάλυψη της προέλευσης του κορονοϊού έρχονται σιγά σιγά στο φως, καθώς ο επικεφαλής της ομάδας έρευνας του Παγκόσμιου Οργανισμού Υγείας παραδέχθηκε ότι η Κίνα είχε παραποιήσει την έκθεση προέλευσης του COVID. Και πιστεύετε ότι ο ασθενής 0 ήταν εργαζόμενος στο Ινστιτούτο Ιολογίας της Γουχάν, όπου διεξάγονταν πειράματα για τον κορονοϊό, αλλά η Κίνα αρνήθηκε να συνεργαστεί, δηλώνοντας ότι κάθε προσπάθεια να διερευνηθεί η θεωρία της διαρροής από το εργαστήριο είναι ενάντια στην επιστήμη.
Διαβάζω εντάξει σήμερα στον τύπο πληροφορίες ότι αυτός ο κύριος Γκεμπρεγέσιους, τον ξέρεις αυτόν τον κύριο, πολύ γνωστός μας, είναι ο επικεφαλής του Παγκοσμίου Οργανισμού, παραδέχεται σε κατηδίαν συνομιλίες ότι είναι πιθανότατο να έχει ξεφύγει από την Ουχάν ο ιός από το εργαστήριο. Αυτό δηλαδή που έλεγεται ως θεωρία συνωμοσίας στην αρχή, τώρα λέγεται από τα πιο επίσημα χείλη.
Όταν πρωτοξεκίνησε.
Ο πρώτος, το 19. Ναι. Όταν εμφανίστηκε ο ιός, λέγεται τότε αυτό, ότι ξέφυγε από τα εργαστήρια του Ουχάν. Τώρα το λέει και Γκεμπρεγέσιους αυτό. Διαβάζω εντάξει σήμερα στον τύπο πληροφορίες ότι αυτός ο κύριος Γκεμπρεγέσιους, τον ξέρεις αυτόν τον κύριο, πολύ γνωστός μας, είναι ο επικεφαλής του Παγκοσμίου Οργανισμού, παραδέχεται σε κατηδίαν συνομιλίες ότι είναι πιθανότατο να έχει ξεφύγει από την Ουχάν ο ιός από το εργαστήριο. Αυτό δηλαδή που έλεγεται ως θεωρία συνωμοσίας στην αρχή, τώρα λέγεται από τα πιο επίσημα χείλη.
Όταν πρωτοξεκίνησε.
Ο πρώτος, το 19. Όταν εμφανίστηκε ο ιός, λέγεται τότε αυτό, ότι ξέφυγε από τα εργαστήρια του Ουχάν. Τώρα το λέει και Γκεμπρεγέσιους αυτό.
15 months ago, a group of Chinese scientists working on the ground at the scene of the outbreak of a brand new virus came to the conclusion that the novel coronavirus probably escaped from a government lab in Wuhan. These Chinese scientists said that in the clearest possible terms and then posted it on the internet. From our perspective, this struck us as an amazing and important story, and also, by the way, plausible. We expected a flurry of media interest in it. Where did this virus come from? That seemed worth knowing as people were dying of it. But no one asked the question. Instead, there was silence, punctuated only by occasional smirking about anti-Asian racism and conspiracy theories. And that's where it stood for more than a year, until just a few weeks ago. Then suddenly, for reasons we still don't really understand, all the smirking morons in the American news media changed their view completely overnight. Of course Corona escaped from a Chinese virology lab, duh! What do you think, it came from a wet market? Come on. That was the new consensus. An avalanche of evidence followed. The Wall Street Journal confirmed that the first corona victims seemed to have been researchers working with bat viruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. BuzzFeed then obtained thousands of emails showing that Tony Fauci knew from the beginning that COVID may have been manufactured in China in dangerous experiments he helped pay for. The lab leak theory, it turns out, was never crazy. It was always likely true. So why did they lie to us about it for so long? A shocking new piece in, of all places, the celebrity suck-up magazine Vanity Fair, answers that question in great detail. You should read it. In short, many research scientists are addicted to American tax dollars. If the American public understood just how recklessly they have behaved, endangering the entire world with their weird little experiments in poorly regulated labs in China, that money might dry up. As a former NSC official called Jamie Metzl put it succinctly, quote, if the pandemic started as part of a lab leak, it had the potential to do to virology what 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl did to nuclear science. Can't have that. Got to keep the money flowing. So they lied about it. And then they intimidated anyone who tried to tell the truth. That would include the director of the CDC, Robert Redfield. Redfield received death threats from scientists after he suggested that the virus may have come from a lab.
I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
It's not some guy on Twitter. That's the former director of the CDC. So you think the world would stop and ask follow-up questions such as, why do you think that? Where's the evidence? But that's not what happened. Quote, I was threatened and ostracized because I proposed another hypothesis, Redfield told Vanity Fair. I expected it from politicians. I didn't expect it from science. But maybe he should have. Redfield had dared to buck the orthodoxy that had been imposed by the global scientific establishment. Described fact checkers, the one who control the flow of information in our country now, used the Lancet letter to censor anyone on social media who mentioned the possibility of a lab leak. It can't be true. The Lancet says it's not true. 27 eminent scientists say it's not true. Only a few scientists in the face of all of this dared to speak up. One of them was called Gilles Dumenuf. He formed a group of researchers called DRASTIC. That's an acronym for Decentralized Radical Autonomous Search Team, something that all scientists should be. Jamie Metzel, the former NSC official, soon joined the group. Almost immediately, as early as April of last year, it was becoming clear to Metzel that the lab leak theory was not a conspiracy theory. In fact, it was plausible.
I think that if I had to just bet based on what I've read and logic, I would bet it's most likely this was an accidental leak from a lab.
So it turns out that Metzel wasn't exactly speculating on that. Unlike the scientific establishment, he and DRASTIC had evidence that they had bothered to gather. They found that the official scientific consensus had in fact been doctored at the source. In one instance, they discovered that Xi Li, the bat lady in Wuhan, had collected samples of a bat coronavirus that were virtually identical to COVID-19. Where did she get these samples? Well, she found them in a cave in the Yunnan province in China. Several miners had been killed there after inhaling the bat guano left by these bats. She recognized this virus was significant because it had moved directly to humans without going through an intermediate animal host first. The Chinese seemed to be looking for the most dangerous virus they could find, and in that cave they found it. After the coronavirus pandemic began, Xi Li tried to hide that COVID-19 was virtually identical to this virus that she had collected in the mine. In her records, she renamed the virus to hide its source. Peter Daszak then published a paper with Xi Li categorizing all the various coronavirus strains they had encountered in recent years. The paper listed hundreds of them. And yet somehow, and you'll be surprised by this, they omitted the deadly viruses found in the Yunnan mine. Funny. Were those viruses significant? Well, the government of China appears to think they are. Late last year, journalists with the BBC tried to visit that mine to get some answers. And when they got there, they were followed by plainclothes police officers. They found the road to the mine had been blocked by a broken-down truck. So the Chinese government covered this up. But here's the worst part, and the most shocking part if you're an American. Some within the U.S. government helped them cover it up. They knew all along this was going on, but they buried the truth too, because their interests were aligned with the interests of the Chinese government. Christopher Park, a director in the State Department's Non-Proliferation Bureau, told the agency's investigators, quote, not to say anything that would point to the U.S. government's own role in gain-of-function research. Now, why would he say that? It turns out that Christopher Park was involved in the 2017 decision, a world-changing decision it turned out, to lift the federal moratorium on funding gain-of-function research. Vanity Fair obtained a memo from Thomas D'Annunzio, who was then the acting assistant secretary of the State Department's Arms Control Bureau. In that memo, he wrote that staff from 2 State Department bureaus had warned leaders within his office, quote, not to pursue an investigation into the origin of COVID-19 because it would, quote, open a can of worms. These are Americans working to hide the truth of the origin of COVID-19 from a country that's been destroyed by COVID-19.
To begin with, I certainly didn't approach the issue with any sort of suspicion or foregone conclusions. However, things began to change as the pandemic evolved.
Sir Richard Dearlove also ran into resistance to the lab leak theory. He's the former head of the British spy agency, MI6. Early in the pandemic, 2 scientists asked for his help in publishing a paper that cast doubt on COVID-19 coming from an infected animal.
We approached Nature, we approached Science, we approached the American Journal of Virology, we approached various publications in the UK, and it was clear to me that there was a sort of united front not to put anything in the public domain which questioned the Chinese narrative.
How disturbing is this censorship? And do you think it amounted to Chinese disinformation?
I'm pretty sure that the Chinese, after the outbreak in Wuhan, and they're very good at doing this, sat down and, developed their own information campaign.
So, Richard, you were one of the first people internationally to come out and say this virus may be the result of a laboratory leak. How were you treated after you made those remarks?
I had people saying to me, Richard, my strong advice is you don't get involved in this issue. It's conspiracy theory. And I mean, my reply to them was, if that's what you really think, you haven't really looked at the science. You don't understand the arguments. And I suggest you go back and delve into this a bit more deeply, because you're going to find some pretty strange things when you do. Boy, did I get put-downs from, some very important parts of government who basically were keen that I shut up.
Was this by British government or British intelligence?
I leave it to your imagination, given my past links.
Why were so many scientists against the lab leak theory? Well, one of the reasons was United States President Donald Trump.
Yes, unfortunately, you could say that the Trump factor contaminated the argument quite seriously. And I think there were a significant number of prominent scientists who did not want publicly to appear to be supporting Trump.
Before the pandemic, much of the world had never heard of the term gain of function. Put simply, it's genetically manipulating a virus to give it new functions, like the ability to infect humans. That's what was happening inside the Wuhan lab.
There is quite a logical explanation when you look at the virus and its special characteristics. That, this is the result of taking a natural virus and mucking around with it.
I've been investigating Anthony Fauci's involvement in funding coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology for months now. Some of these discoveries I have already reported. I found out that his agency had funded 60 projects at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I found out that he wrote a paper back in 2012 where he argued that gain-of-function research, that's genetically manipulating coronaviruses to make them even more dangerous and more transmissible, Fauci said that this was worth the risk of a pandemic. And he even funded research, his agency funded coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in conjunction with the Chinese military. I mean, this is just astonishing and unthinkable. Why would America be funding research at a Wuhan lab in conjunction with the Chinese military? Fauci was up to his neck funding research in Wuhan, and it's something he himself, eventually, just a couple of months ago, had to admit.
It was incumbent upon us to study the animal-human interface and to understand what potential these viruses have of infecting humans, which then might damage the United States. So please let me finish. So you don't want to go to Hoboken, New Jersey, or to Fairfax, Virginia, to be studying the bat-human interface that might lead to an outbreak. So you go to China.
This just shows how incredibly stupid Anthony Fauci is. If there's a contagious coronavirus outbreak in China, obviously it's going to affect the rest of the world. And that's exactly what we've seen with this pandemic. What sort of public health official doesn't understand that outbreaks can go global? It's unthinkable that he is still the top medical advisor to the president. He should have been sacked by now. He rammed through the decision to lift that Obama-era ban on gain-of-function research. Now, here's what's new. In the documentary that airs on Sky News tomorrow night, I ask President Donald Trump about this. I ask him if in the early days of the pandemic, when Fauci was sitting there in the Oval Office, in every single meeting as the virus was breaking out, if he ever spoke up and told him that he actually knows that there's a lab in Wuhan called the Wuhan Institute of Virology that was engaging in this research that was genetically manipulating coronaviruses, creating these Frankenstein-like viruses. Here's a sneak peek. Have a look at what Trump says. Did he ever once mention to you that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was genetically manipulating coronaviruses?
Well, no, he didn't. And, you know, Anthony's been in government for many, many years. He's a bureaucratic kind of a guy, a very great promoter. I give him an A+ as a promoter and probably a C or a D as a doctor.
So that's former President Donald Trump admitting that Anthony Fauci stayed silent in Oval Office meetings at the start of the pandemic. He kept quiet on everything he knew about the type of risky research that was underway at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Never mentioned that his agency was funding this and that he actually knew a whole lot about it. In the documentary, we also hear from Chinese defectors who amazingly first discovered that there was a coronavirus spreading in Wuhan back in October 2019. Wade, did you have any sense that the intelligence agencies in the United States in November 2019 were taking this seriously, that there may be a virus spreading in Wuhan?
I felt they were not as concerned as I was, so I tried my best to provide more detail and information. They may not believe a government of a country would do something like that. So I kept repeating myself. In an effort, I tried to persuade them.
And this is then a point that I take up with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and I ask him how concerned he is that the intelligence agencies might have either missed this or either didn't act on these serious warnings that were coming in from highly credible Chinese defectors. And Wei Jingsheng, who you just saw there, he's known as the father of China's democracy movement. He's the most famous Chinese defector to the United States. His defection back in 1997 made global headlines. So I asked Mike Pompeo how worried he is about the possibility that these warnings were missed, and even whether this is a pandemic that could have been prevented had he paid close, well, not he, but had the agencies paid closer attention to the intelligence that was coming in and heeded the warnings of people like Wei Jingsheng.